Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're setting up the ultimate legal clash. On one side, you have the absolute, desperate need to fight a rampant wave of violent crime. On the other, the sacred duty to protect innocent citizens from wrongful conviction. So how does a society actually balance these two incredibly heavy, opposing forces? Well, we're going to explore a landmark constitutional case that forces us to look right into the heart of the justice system.
Okay, let's dive right in by imagining this scenario for a second. You're walking down the street, totally minding your own business. An acquaintance comes up and asks if you can help them carry a cardboard box, just a few blocks. You agree, completely unaware that simply holding this box might literally flip the entire justice system against you. If a police officer stops you right then, could you be presumed a criminal just because you're holding that box?
Section 1. The encounter with Shorty. To really understand the real-world stakes here, we have to travel back to the busy streets of central Johannesburg in May of 1997. Because this isn't just some theoretical legal puzzle, right? It started with a very real, everyday encounter. Two men, Samuel Manamela and Jabulani Madlalos, were walking through Joburg carrying boxes. The police stopped them, and as it turns out, the goods inside those boxes had just been stolen from a nearby vehicle. Now, Samuel and Jabulani swore they didn't steal anything. This said a local hawker they knew only as Shorty had simply asked them to help carry the boxes to a taxi rank. They completely believed the boxes belonged to Shorty. And here's the crazy part. The trial magistrate actually accepted that their story could reasonably be true. Yet, despite that, they were both convicted and sentenced to 6 and 7 years in prison. So you have to ask, how does that even happen? Let's look at the timeline to see how this escalated from a simple street-level bust into a massive constitutional debate. After their arrest in May 1997 and that incredibly harsh sentencing in the regional court, they appealed. By October 1998, they were in the High Court, and they were unrepresented. But the High Court judge noticed something deeply troubling about the specific law used to convict them, and he raised a massive constitutional red flag. This set the stage for showdown that finally landed at the highest court in South Africa, the Constitutional Court, in November 1999. Section 2. The reverse onus trap. The trap that caught Samuel and Jabulani was a specific piece of legislation, Section 37(1) of the General Law Amendment Act of 1955. This law was originally designed to catch people who buy or handle stolen goods, effectively starving the market for thieves. But the way it went about doing this was incredibly aggressive. It used something called a reverse onus. Now, what's really fascinating here is how this reverse onus fundamentally flips the traditional script of the criminal justice system. We all know the golden rule, right? Innocent until proven guilty. The state has the burden to prove you committed a crime. A reverse onus turns that completely upside down. It basically says, under certain conditions, we're going to presume you're guilty, and the burden shifts to you to prove your innocence. Let's break down exactly how Section 37 works in practice. Step 1. The state merely has to prove you are in physical possession of stolen goods acquired outside of a public market. That's literally it. Once you're holding Shorty's box, bam, Step 2 kicks in. You are now legally obligated to prove, on a balance of probabilities, that you had a reasonable cause to believe the goods weren't stolen. If you can't convince the judge that your story is highly probable, you're going to jail.
Section 3. Silence and presumed innocence.
When this whole mechanism was elevated to the Constitutional Court, the justices had to examine how this outdated law clashed with the newly minted Constitution of South Africa, and they zeroed right in on two fundamental rights that were completely shattered by Section 37. First, by demanding you explain Shorty's box, the law strips away your right to remain silent. If the state proves you held the box and you choose to stay silent, conviction is an absolute certainty. You are literally forced to testify. But even worse, it destroys the presumption of innocence. Because the burden is on you to prove your innocence on a balance of probabilities, a judge could actually have a reasonable doubt about your guilt. They might think your story could very well be true, but they are still legally forced to convict you and send you to prison for years.
Section 4. A sledgehammer for a nut.
So, the Constitutional Court was actually deeply divided on how to handle this. Let's look impartially at the majority judgment first, authored by Justices Mandela, Sachs, and Yakub. They totally acknowledged that stopping the market for stolen goods is a crucial social need, but they were deeply alarmed by the mechanics of the law. Their view was brilliant in its simplicity. The Constitution does not permit a sledgehammer to be used to crack a nut. Sure, the state needs tools to fight crime, for sure, but forcing accused citizens to carry the full burden of proving their innocence, risking years in prison, that's a dangerous overreach. It's a tool that is way too blunt and way too destructive to civil liberties. The majority was especially concerned with how this law played out on the ground. Think about the disproportionate impact here. This law casts a massive net over the poor, the unskilled, and the illiterate. Consider the social reality for a second. People in informal economies frequently buy everyday goods, clothing, food, cooking utensils, door to door. They aren't getting official printed receipts for the stuff. If it turns out those goods were stolen, these vulnerable citizens are the least equipped to afford expensive lawyers or articulate their innocence in a formal courtroom. The majority concluded that the risk of erroneously convicting innocent people was just unacceptably high.
Section 5. The duty of diligence. But remember, this wasn't a unanimous decision. Let's shift our focus to the really powerful dissenting minority view from Justices O'Regan and Cameron. They looked at the exact same law, the exact same constitutional rights, and they came to a completely different conclusion. They argued that the reverse onus was actually entirely justified in a modern democratic society that's facing a severe crime epidemic. The minority draws this really direct line between seemingly minor acts, like carrying Shorty's box, and devastating violence. They pointed out that the receipt of stolen goods is a vital link in the chain of criminality. The black market is the economic engine that incentivizes violent crimes like carjacking, mugging, and armed robbery. To stop the violence, they argued you have to choke the market, and that requires demanding real accountability from absolutely everyone.
The minority also argued that citizens actually have a duty of diligence. In a society ravaged by crime, we just can't turn a blind eye to where goods come from. Plus, they pointed out that judges aren't robots, right? They use objective factors to determine if someone's story is reasonable. Courts are going to look closely at the nature of the goods, the price paid, how they were acquired, and the specific social context of the person involved. The minority firmly believed these safeguards were more than enough to protect the truly innocent while still aggressively prosecuting those who intentionally or even negligently fuel the black market.
Section 6. The court's final fix. So you have this sharp divide. A majority that believes the law is a dangerous sledgehammer, and a minority that believes it's a completely necessary shield against violent crime. How did the Constitutional Court finally resolve this clash? Well, they couldn't just strike down the law completely and leave this massive vacuum where criminals could trade freely. They had to repair it. And they did this using a constitutional remedy known as reading in. They essentially did surgery on the text of the law. They removed that harsh reverse onus, the requirement to prove your innocence on a balance of probabilities. In its place, they read in a new evidential burden. So now, if you get caught with Shorty's box, you still have to give an explanation. You can't just stay totally silent without consequence. But, and this is the game changer, you only need to provide enough evidence to raise a reasonable doubt in the judge's mind. If the judge thinks your story about Shorty might reasonably be true, the state fails to prove its case, and you walk free. The state still gets a powerful tool to fight crime, but the presumption of innocence is safely restored.
Which brings us to our final thought. The Constitutional Court found a really clever middle ground, but that underlying tension, it still remains. In a society plagued by organized crime and violent theft, what is our civic duty? Should we have to prove our innocence to stop the market for stolen goods? Or is the risk of sending just one innocent person to jail for holding a cardboard box a price that is simply too high to pay? It's an incredibly delicate balance between eradicating violent crime and protecting our most fundamental civil liberties. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and I really hope this gives you a fresh new lens through which to view the laws that govern our everyday lives.